So we'll just give it a couple of minutes as I see people are starting to file in to the virtual room. Okay, great. I think we'll get started. Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Susan Coftree. I'm Director of the Foreign Policy Centre. I'm very excited that the Foreign Policy Centre is collaborating with the Centre for Russian, European and Eurasian Studies, CREES, at the University of Birmingham for this short series of webinars on the wider impacts of the current conflict in Ukraine. This first session, the impact of war in Ukraine on the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. We've got a great panel lined up, so I'm not going to take too long, but rather instead directly introduce our chair, Stuart MacDonald, who's the MP for Glasgow South, and also a vice chair of the Ukraine APPG, so well placed to lead this discussion. Thank you again, Stuart, for joining us, and I'm just going to hand the floor directly over to you.
Well, Susan, thank you so much for that introduction, and an enormous thank you from me to you for inviting me to chair this session. I'm enormously looking forward to it, and I have just told the panelists before we've gone live that I'm a believer that a poor chair is a fever of time. So the less you hear from me and the more we hear from the panelists and the more time we get for questions, the better. So what I propose to do as we come to the panelists, I have my order here, as we come to the panelists, if I could just ask each of them to very, very briefly introduce yourself for your opening remarks. Each panelist will speak to between 5 and 7 minutes. I will interrupt any panelist who goes beyond that, but I'm sure we won't. And then we'll be able to come to questions. And just if I say anything wrong here to one of the tech people who are on the call, I think I'm right in saying that we're asking people to use the Q&A function for questions as opposed to the chat function. But if that changes, I will let you know. And so with that, I think we're going to come to our first panelist this morning, Dr. Ayjan Sharshinova. Doctor, if I could ask you just briefly introduce yourself, and then you have 5 to 7 minutes for your opening remarks. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Stuart. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever the time zone you're at the moment. My name is Ayjan Sharshinova. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the OSCE Academy in Bishkek and also research fellow at the Foreign Policy Centre in London. My research primarily focuses on Russian politics. So I started as a postdoctoral research fellow focusing on Russian foreign policy, soft power, public diplomacy. So it has been an interesting turn of events for me last year. So February 24th, 2022 has become a watershed moment for a variety of reasons. For the Russian politics observers, it has signified a new phase in Russian foreign policy directions, from the Western aspirations of the early 90s to the new revisionism of the early 2000s. Russia has peaked in its assertive foreign policy last year, and it has turned its foreign policy into a very different and, to be fair, unexpected direction. So quite a few of Russia observers did not expect that would happen. In terms of global politics, it has certainly shifted a lot of alliances in the world. It has put a lot of alliances in a very difficult position. The BRICS countries, as well as many other countries who find themselves in various alliances with Russia, found themselves in a very tricky situation. So now we have South Africa declaring that they might have to arrest President Putin if he arrives to the BRICS summit. We have China that voted in favor of a UN resolution that mentions Russian aggression. We have other countries who are questioned repeatedly on their position with regards to Russia and trying to avoid secondary sanctions as well, some of them especially in my neck of the woods. As well as global politics and Russian politics, we had a massive shift in the politics of the former Soviet Union territory. It was certainly a new level of separation, a new level of building and rebuilding or revising relationships with Russia, Obviously, 1991 was the collapse of the Soviet Union and the formal establishment of sovereign nations, but the political collapse did not happen right then. It took a bit of time. And I believe that last year has become a new crack or a new division that set new direction for a variety of former Soviet countries. And they're still finding. It was also at the public level, I think it was a new bout of identity searching for Russian-speaking communities in the former Soviet Union, because before, for the most of the 20th century, there was an effort to build a shared Soviet identity, with Russian language being the language of that unites people. However, we have discovered last year that cultural belonging to the Russian sphere or being a Russian speaker comes with a certain cost. And I think quite a few countries in the former Soviet Union are thinking deeply about this. So overall, February 24th, 2022 has become a massive shift in the national politics and the regional politics and Russian politics. And it is still quite early to make any conclusions. Nevertheless, it is quite interesting to sort of discuss what's been happening for the last year and what sort of implications it might have both to the region and to the world. Thank you.
Well, you've come in massively under time. That's almost unheard of whenever I've chaired any of these sessions. Thank you very much for that. Next on my list is Dr. Yi Wang. Doctor, if you could just very briefly introduce yourself, and then you have a generous 5 to 7 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Good morning from UK. My name is Yi. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Birmingham, and I'm a political scientist with a regional focus on China and East Asia. My opening talk will have 3 points, generally. The first is about the war's impact on China's relationship with generally the West, basically means the United States and the EU. Of course, there's already been very strained relationship between these two sides since, I would say, recent years. But this war would add more challenges and also tensions to the relationship between China and the West. Especially for the United States, I think it's been quite clear that it will not, say, tolerate the China's position if China offer any, military assistance to Russia. And there's also basically now there's no hope that China can fundamentally improve relationship with the United States. For EU, it's become a bit more complicated because as we saw that the French president visited China and basically courted the Chinese government. So perhaps there's more diverse opinions in EU regarding how to deal with China. And so we will see what kind of role China will play in the future relationship with Russia and also on the war. And that could fundamentally perhaps have more impact over its relationship with the EU. And second, I would remind everybody that this war actually have a really significant impact on China in Asia, because the Russian aggression of Ukraine reminded people that the possibility of the mainland China's use of force on Taiwan. So suddenly Taiwan become a very hot topic among perhaps many Asian experts and politicians. So if you look at Japan or South Korea or Philippines, I think they are worrying about the potential military conflict between mainland China and Taiwan. Let me give you one example. We have seen a massive military building up in Japan, which is the most significant since the end of the World War II. The current Prime Minister Kishida in Japan said that last year that the Ukraine may be East Asia's future or tomorrow. So they really worry about this kind of because as we know that U.S. has several very big military bases in Japan, including Okinawa, which is really close to Taiwan. So if the war happened there, and perhaps Japan will be inevitably dragged into the war, which is, I would say that the people in Japan are completely not well prepared for a future war regarding the post-war pacifism in Japan. So in last year, December, Japan published the 3 very important security documents. It is clearly stated that the future goal will include, for example, to build up the counter-strike capability, which means that Japan will build up its capacity to hit missile-related sites within a attacking country. Perhaps give Japan a bit more offensive ability, which is completely unthinkable in the past decades. And meanwhile, the security documents, this kind of reports also clearly say that China is a unprecedented and greatest security challenge for Japan. And meanwhile, last but not least, that Japan plans to increase its military budget to 2% of its GDP, which is also the NATO standard. And actually, even more interesting thing we can see now is the public opinion in Japan is also in favor of the increase in military spending, and even including the revision of the Constitution Article 9, which basically banned Japan to declare a war on other sovereign states. So again, this is completely unthinkable a few years ago, but now I think the people in Japan realize that, well, their security under threat if a war break up between mainland China and Taiwan. And meanwhile, I can see that today, recently, South Korea is also strengthening its security relationship with the United States. And the current President Yoon said that well, Taiwan issue would be a global issue. And that actually created quite a lot of tension between Seoul and Beijing. And Philippines now providing 4 new security bases for the United States Army. So we can see that the tension in this region, I mean, in Asia Pacific, is significantly growing after since the war happened in Ukraine. And third, but not least, is that it's interesting to see that how the Chinese people or public perception on Russia is changing since the war. Of course, public opinion does not matter too much in authoritarian states, but it has some, I should say, perhaps some feedback to leadership. Well, first of all, it's generally, well, China and Russia have a long relationship of conflict and cooperation. So it's really complicated history. So currently, if we see public opinion poll and my own study, basically most people in China, at least on the internet, are supporting Russia, and they borrow this kind of Russian narratives of this kind of Nazification of Ukraine or like that. But there's also a significant margin in China public opinion, or you can see social media discourse, that there are also people who are against Russia and feel sympathetic with Ukraine. So I mean, this impact will be lasting. It does depend on Russia's performance, military performance in Ukraine, and also the consequence of the war. So I think at least at social level, the war complicates this, I should say, the people's perception of Russia and its China relationship with Russia. Okay, thank you. That's my talk.
Dr. Wang, thank you very much. That was incredibly interesting. We now come to Dr. Anuradha Chinoy. Doctor, if you could again just briefly introduce yourself, and then I'll give you a generous 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Anuradha Chinoy, and I've been a professor. I'm still a professor, and I teach Eurasia and other topics in international relations. So I'm going to make about 5 or 6 points on how India is reacting to this war and its role in the BRICS. Now, as we know that BRICS do not have any coordinated position, and but on Russia, I noticed that there are some commonalities of positions. As far as India's position is concerned, I think it's well known that they have been very clearly a so-called neutral, in that they've abstained from voting against Russia in the United Nations. But there is I'm not going to go into what is well known, but there is commentary today in a lot of press in the West and elsewhere that India is gaining significantly from the Ukraine war, and there is some truth to that. In that, India has refused to sanction and it has rejected the price caps on oil imports. And so Indian trade with Russia has grown by 400% since this war. And it's mostly due to a 700% increase in petroleum products from Russia. And reports also show, and studies have shown, at least they claim, because there's no official response on it, that there are companies that buy Russian crude at discounted rates, refine this and sell it to others, including the West. And of course, the Russian imports and Indian exports to Russia continue somewhat gingerly to avoid secondary sanctions. But nonetheless, defense imports, the nuclear relationship, etc., continues. But this is not the entire picture of why India is very firm on its neutrality, and I believe will continue like that. And that is because India is deeply invested in the concept of multipolarity. And it believes it has a role in constructing this. Now, this is not new. If you see India-Russia, a foundational document, the main strategic document which guides them currently, that was signed in January 2000, it says both India and Russia believe that it is important to build a multipolar global structure based on sovereignty, etc. So, and of course, BRICS also supports this multipolarity. It is the aim of all BRICS countries, and it's there in various documents. So India really sees both Russia and BRICS as their strategic aim. However, India does not promote any anti-Western narrative in these bodies or in any of their bilateral dealings, because it doesn't fit into the current narrative of the West versus some other superpower or group of great powers. So India has created an operational maneuverability for themselves, where they believe that they have the capacity to negotiate between sides on their own. Now, my next point is that India does not share the framing of the West about the Ukraine conflict. Right from the beginning, and that continues. They believe that Russia has what, quote unquote, legitimate security interests that need to be safeguarded. And if there's any negotiation or peace agreement, the agreement should be inclusive. India said this in the United Nations and openly everywhere, that this is a proxy war. And again, this position is not new. Now look at India's position in 2014, when Russia had that action and invaded Crimea. India was one of the few countries that supported Russian action in 2014 and said at the same words that Russia has legitimate interests and these need to be safeguarded, that Crimea has been part of Russia for 3 centuries, etc. So there is this continuity with Russia. So India really resists any Western pressure that seeks to influence it. And they believe that Russia does not pressurize them into this position either. And my next point is that there is an extraordinary consensus within India across every political party and sector on this position. One, of neutrality. Second, opposition to sanctions. And third, on multipolarity. Now, despite, the kind of pretty that fear of dissent, which has crept into the Indian political spectrum, this is a spontaneous and official view of parties from left to center to right. So there is a consensus. And there is also a belief that India voices, gives voice to voices of the global South. So they do talk about their concerns on the energy and food crisis, but they also blame it not just on the war, but also on sanctions. So therefore, just to conclude, India believes its development as a post-colonial state and its emergence and its future as an emerging power rests on this neutrality and strategic autonomy. And operationally, this means being a global balancer and also continuing its links with Russia. And lastly, as far as China is concerned, they again have not given in to Western pressure, of this fear of China, because India has a genuine problem of the border with unresolved border issues with China. But here too, they believe that they have the capacity to deal with this on a bilateral basis. They do not want to be any part of any really military alliance. They can be part of other structures, broad security structures, but which would pressure them. Thank you very much.
Dr. Chinoy, thank you. That was immensely interesting. Can I just remind people, if you have questions, the Q&A function is there. We're about to come to Elizabeth Sideropoulos, and then we'll start to take questions that people might have. I fully intend to use my position as chair and kick that off. But Elizabeth, if I could come to you, and if you could again just very briefly introduce yourself, and then you've got a generous 5 to 7 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Sideropoulos. I'm the Chief Executive at the South African Institute of International Affairs here in Johannesburg. It's an independent international affairs think tank on the lines of Chatham House, if we're to draw parallels. I also just want to make one point. We are in the middle of what we call here load shedding, which means that my connectivity might be a little weak. The generator is running, but I hope that you can all hear me and that I won't be kicked out as I was a few minutes ago. Okay, let me start by echoing some of the points that Dr. Chinoy highlighted about India that are also relevant very much so for South Africa. South Africa, since the dawn of democracy in 1994, has always emphasized, in first instance, its commitment to multilateralism and to the UN as the apex body of the global governance system, but very, very critically also its commitment to a more multipolar world. That the world that we're living in now is the current rules-based international order is one that is dominated by the American hegemon. The rules apply to some, but not to others. So the issue of double standards, and that while a rules-based system is critical, particularly for middle and smaller powers. Great powers can always do what they wish, but certainly for smaller powers, those rules as they are at the current moment do not always advance developing country interests, and certainly not that of South Africa. And just as an aside, article published by a colleague from Cape Town where he talks about the order of oppression, Africa's quest for a new international system, and makes exactly some of those points. So in many ways, in the context of South Africa's membership of the BRICS, there is a similar worldview with, I would argue, all of the BRICS countries in the fact that reform global order as it is does not really advance our interests in many areas. There is also an added dimension to the way in which South Africa has engaged on the war in Ukraine. And this is, of course, that the current South African government, the African National Congress, has historical relations with, of course, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and with the Soviet Union, but it sees the Russian government, Russia, as very much the successor state party to that relationship, notwithstanding the fact that Ukraine, of course, was part of that, the Soviet Union. And so the position that South Africa has taken, much like the rest of the BRICS, we've seen that in countless UN General Assembly resolutions, is to abstain and to argue that South Africa wishes to conduct and to have an independent foreign policy, and one that is non-aligned, which is the way in which it sees its interests being advanced. That, in other words, taking one or another is not in, or being with one or another camp is not in South Africa's interest. Of course, what we have seen play out over the last year is increase. And just as an aside, or an important observation, on the 24th of February 2022, South Africa, the Foreign Ministry did issue a statement, which, among others, called for Russia to withdraw from Ukraine. But over the period then of the year, there was in effect a softening of that stance, or walking back on that stance, and very much, as Dr. Chenoy has highlighted, really emphasizing that this is in effect a proxy war, that Russia has legitimate security concerns, security interests, which have not been appreciated and respected by the West. And was also echoed to some extent in 2014 with Crimea. And so to posit this simply as Ukraine sort of being invaded by Russia, and this is the victim, etc., is not the entire story. In fact, it ignores the broader relations that have played out between NATO and Russia since the end of the Cold War, and the South African government believes very strongly that NATO should not have expanded eastward, and that in fact NATO committed to not expanding eastward. We can argue about that point. The other, we've of course also, in particularly in the last few months, taken certain actions which would argue would put South Africa not in the non-aligned camp, but that it is increasingly moving into being aligned with Russia. And the two particular examples of that relate to military exercises that were conducted with Russia and China on the anniversary of the invasion, and certainly the visit of a ship to Sandstown, which is our naval base, where there was offloading and onloading under cover of darkness earlier in the year, I think, or was it late December, and of course a meeting, a visit by our Minister of Defense to Moscow for a security conference. So all of these sort of, certainly from a Western perspective, would indicate that South Africa is not really non-aligned, that it has taken a position. South Africa has continued to call for a resolution to the conflict through peaceful means, negotiation, etc. It believes that this has to be put front and center, and that the way in which the West is engaging by arming Ukraine isn't helping that. The other dimension that we have to deal with more recently is, of course, the International Criminal Court arrest warrant for Putin. South Africa this year is the BRICS summit, and so it has put South Africa in a rather invidious position, because unlike India, Brazil, Russia, and China, South Africa, but together with Brazil, South Africa is a member of the International Criminal Court. It has domesticated the Rome Statute into its own legislation, and there have been also a series of court cases now. Summit in August, South Africa would have to arrest him if it were to stick to its own laws. What has happened in the ensuing period is, of course, that South Africa also doesn't want to run foul of legislation. The matter is still in process. A couple of points to highlight. is obviously, in terms of our economic relations, the West is by far the most important for us. Europe and the US are our biggest, or among and China are among our biggest export markets, in contrast to Russia. So many in South Africa have argued that it doesn't make sense for South Africa to either sort of be towards Russia. Recent weeks, particularly after the naval exercises, that the House of Representatives in the US has tabled a bill, or at least prepared a bill that would sanction South Africa, that might see South Africa actually being thrown out of the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act that provides us with preferential access to the US market. From an economic perspective,
Elizabeth, if I can ask you just to begin to come to a close, that'd be great. Thanks.
So let me wrap up. I think there are 2 points then that, from a South African perspective, are important to remember. South Africa prides itself in maintaining an independent foreign policy and not being told what position to take. It is opposed to sanctions globally that do not emanate from the UN Security Council or the UN, and also doesn't appreciate language that is couched in kind of regime change. And some of the discussions in the West around Putin, of course, have followed that pattern. And so that's where South Africa is.
Great, thank you so much for that, Elizabeth. I was willing to let you go over because we did have some extra time, but that's managed to spark 5 questions so far from those joining us. So that means I don't have to abuse my position as chair and start the Q&A session myself. I propose to read the questions, and if our panel are happy to kind of indicate that they want to come in and answer, do so, and I will get around as many of you as possible. If we could try and keep answers short, relatively short, that would be good. And similarly, when people are putting their questions in, the shorter you keep them, then the less there is for me to have to read out. So I'm going to kick off with the first one, which is from an anonymous attendee. The question is, by implication, India does not acknowledge the legitimacy of the UN Charter with respect to unacceptability of the use of force to resolve international disputes, non-violation of borders, etc. How does India frame its position formally? Is it somehow neutral with respect to the UN Charter? What is the basis for multilateralism without the basis of something like the UN Charter? Is its commitment to multilateralism in any way inconsistent with its determination to solve its own border disputes in its own bilateral way? And Dr. Chinoy, that strikes me as an obvious one for you to kick us off. If anyone else on the panel wants to come in, just indicate to me and I'll come to you, and then we can get some more questions in. Dr. Chinoy.
Yes, thank you for that question. And that really shows the paradoxes that countries face in the international system and how they're able to sidestep and confront this. So actually, India says that they are one of the most committed to the UN Charter, that they function within its framework, that they do not accept the use of force and everything that you have outlined. But operationally, when they're looking, for example, at Russia, I mean, and they use this when it was a case of Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan, India was citing this continuously in all the other earlier interventions. But in this case, they have, I think, very neatly sidestepped it by saying that the position of both sides need to be seen, that and what Elizabeth argued, for example, that this is a proxy war. This was a civil war which started in 2014, in which Russia intervened on one side and Ukraine, with the support of the United States, intervened for the other side, so East and West Ukraine. And various Indian national security people from the Indian National Security Advisory Board, etc., have said this publicly, that they were there in 2014. They saw the regime change. They felt that Minsk 1 and 2 should have been honored, but it wasn't. And they said that they felt that For 30 years, Russia has said NATO should not expand and that the last straw was Ukraine. So they were not surprised that Russia had to do something. This was an existential threat. It was like, for example, if the United States started putting nuclear missiles on the India-Pakistan border, India would not have accepted it. So these are the kind of examples. Or if it had put missiles on the Mexican border, would the United States have accepted it? So these are the kind of arguments that have come into the discourse. And at the same time, they say that they're committed to multilateralism, but they continuously show the double standards and the operational aspects of it. And to solve their own border issues, that's what they argue, that they're trying to do it in a bilateral way. So they do not want to become an Ukraine or a proxy for someone else by having any kind of alliance. So that's how they really see it. Of course, it is the scholars, analysts, and those with ethics who question these paradoxes, but states do reflect them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chinoy. Dr. Wang, did you want to come in?
I don't have a comment on this question.
Maybe no problem. I just thought because you were the only one not on mute that you were hoping to come in, but we can come to the next question.
Okay.
Next question is from Heinz Gartner. What role can the BRICS states play in nuclear disarmament? He's written from Vienna. Does anyone want to come in on that question? Or I'm going to have to pick on someone. Elizabeth.
What is interesting in the question, of course, is you have a state like South Africa, which has been a very strong proponent of nuclear disarmament. It gave up its nuclear weapons just before 1994 as well, one of a handful of states to do so. I suppose Ukraine is the other. We didn't have as many nuclear warheads as Ukraine. And South Africa, I think over the last 30 years has really been a very active participant on nuclear disarmament issues. I think the BRICS as a whole, if we're looking at the BRICS as a collective, I think the picture is very mixed though. The position that South Africa and Brazil take on these is sort of very different from where India, China and Russia sit. Of course, India has the arrangement with the US. For some time, it was trying, South Africa opposed India's entry into the nuclear suppliers group. Where the BRICS as a collective probably would not all be on the same page in terms of the international rules and norms.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. I'm going to come to our third question from Stefan Wolf, who says, thank you all for your great insights so far. It seems that all the BRICS benefit from the changes towards a more multipolar international order that the war in Ukraine signifies and perhaps accelerates. At what point, however, will the continuation of the war or a further escalation make this stance more difficult to sustain? Dr. Shashanova, it feels like it's been a while since we heard from you. I don't know if you want to perhaps come in on that one.
Sure. Thank you very much for your question. Ideally, yes. I mean, the BRICS countries, for all of them, usually state the necessity of increasing the multipolarity in the world and often speak against the West or the US hegemony in international politics. However, the way Russia uses the UN Charter to justify the invasion in Ukraine is a quite tricky legal issue, international law issue, because Russia is appealing a lot to the Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is self-defense. And the Charter clearly states that in the case of an armed attack, the country has the right to apply military means to ensure self-defense. Now, well, at least China and India, as far as I know, have some unresolved border issues, which could be used one way or another. And I think once you open this Pandora box of interpreting the UN Charter the way you want to justify a military invasion, that could backfire really badly. And I think it is already unsustainable, because there is a clear violation of international law, there is a clear violation of UN Charter, because obviously Russia has not been physically attacked from the territory of Ukraine. So there are already a number of international legal issues that are associated with the war. And I think it's getting more and more difficult for the BRICS countries to justify and protect Russia in a way in the international politics, because Russia is quite brazen in the way it explains itself in the international politics. And again, there is a danger of being a pariah in international politics nowadays. There's a danger of secondary sanctions. Financially, they might be benefiting from the war, but politically, maybe not. So I think we are beyond that point. It's just a matter of time, I think. And I think the slight indications of China voting for that revolution, with South Africa saying something that it would probably not dare to say a year ago, it's already like small flags that the BRICS partners are not already happy with the way with the way Russia acts at the moment, or the way Russia justifies its invasion in Ukraine.
Thank you very much for that. Did anybody else want to come in on that question? We can move to the next one. Elizabeth?
On the question of multipolarity, I think we, all BRICS states would like to see a more multipolar world, but the downside, and that's a good thing, because you don't want one calling, one powerful hegemon calling all the shots. But what it does raise is makes a multilateral system much more difficult, because the great powers end up being in a position where they can certainly interpret rules the way they like, but more importantly, arriving at new norms, new institutions that we require for global governance becomes much more difficult when you have to negotiate with many more powerful actors. And I think one of the issues that the BRICS individual countries need to consider is, when we talk about the reform of the global multilateral system, are we all on the same page about what exactly we want to get out of it? And I would argue on some levels, we're probably not, on some issues, we're probably not all on the same page when it comes to the hard recommendations, clear-cut recommendations.
When I was at the UN last year with the Foreign Affairs Committee, and we met various missions there, and it's obvious we are not all on the same page as far as that's concerned, for sure. Okay, we're going to come to Nicole Butters. Nicole asks, which countries are benefiting the most from the purchase of refined Russian oil products, which would otherwise be prohibited due to the Russian crude oil embargoes? Are these countries paying more for refined Russian oil products than they did prior to the invasion of Ukraine? I don't know if Dr. Chinoy, you could have started us off on that one, but Dr. Wang is looking to come in, and I'm going to come to him first because you've not come in on the Q&A yet. Then I'll perhaps come to you, Dr. Chinoy, if you want to. Dr. Wang.
Okay, thank you. Just to remind the audience that China has been the largest importer of oil in the world. So 70% of its oil and 40% of its gas rely on import. Of course, Russia is one of the biggest exporter for China, regarding the oil. And since the war has broke up, actually, Russia now is certainly exporting even more oil to China, and it becomes economically more dependent on China. So, of course, this could give China some advantage in negotiating with Russia in the future. So what I mean is that if we think about China's economically dependency on importing of the natural resources, so China it's significantly restrained China's capacity to to behave in a more assertive way in the world. So in that way, it also means that China cannot really, stay away from Russia. It must rely on Russia's oil export.
Thank you. Dr. Chinoy?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Dr. Wang said, but in addition, I think there's several countries, because this question asked which countries benefit the most. I think there's several countries which are benefiting, and China, of course, is one, but also India significantly. I already mentioned that when I spoke, but also Turkey, which has been promised that it will become an oil hub for Russian oil. And I think even several countries in West Asia are linking up OPEC plus, etc., on oil. So the whole politics of oil and oil pipelines is on the verge of shifting in a sense. And you can see that with some questioning of the petrodollar. That's it, but it's still a work in process, but it has started. So I think we shouldn't ignore that. And one point that I want to make on multipolarity, even though we've moved from that, is that while I think I continuously agree with what Elizabeth said, that all the BRICS are committed to multipolarity, but in significantly different ways. So multipolarity as anti-hegemony is coming out very strongly from China and Russia, but operationally it's different from India, which believes that multipolarity should be negotiated, that it can be a negotiated process, a gradual process, where it would make space for countries like India, Brazil, South Africa, and others to have their voice heard in multilateral fora and multilateralism, which wasn't the case so far. So they do feel that when collectively their GDP is more than that of the West now, of the BRICS countries, yet they have no say in policy-making decision bodies like the IMF, World Bank. So that is what India's aim is really. Thank you.
I wonder if I could extend that question out a bit. I mean, do you think the BRICS countries perhaps have got some real clout when it comes to, for example, raw materials? I know that's one of the things, just before I came off the Foreign Affairs Committee here in London, that was one of the things that we were going to start looking at, because, you know, you talk there about the change of politics vis-a-vis oil. The change of politics as far as raw materials is concerned is really only just starting. Certainly here in London, I think it's only just starting to hit home. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about kind of where are the strengths for the BRICS countries as raw materials start to become more, I don't want to use the word weaponized, but I think you know what I mean. Please. Are
you asking me?
Yes,
okay.
Please.
Yeah, okay. So I think as far as raw materials is concerned, it was always weaponized, because when you have sanctions as a weapon, you know, for countries which have little say, their commodities were hit and their people were hit, and you can see that repeatedly. 70, I think about almost 80 countries have been sanctioned, including India. When we had that nuclear, I opposed nuclear and came out against it. So I was almost had the Western position and attacked over here for it. But India was sanctioned that, you know, by the US. And sanctions never impact regimes. They impact people, they impact exports and the poorest. So they were weaponized. The other thing is that, you see, in the global South, there is a growing discourse and awareness now. It was there in the BRICS countries, but in the non-BRIC countries, like in Africa and Latin America, which are not, they're still on a different development page. They feel that their commodities have been used for extractive purposes. Their oil, they don't even have a refinery. It all goes to some other countries. It's refined and they have to buy it back. That they have to use the French franc, for example, and pay for it every time there's a transaction. West Asia is beginning to feel it for the first time. And I've noticed this on the West Asian street, which is called, you know, West Asian Popular Opinion, which believes that why should the US get benefit from every transaction? Why can't they get it? Why are they so left behind? So that reasoning has finally filtering down at the street level, and regimes are concerned that their legitimacy would be questioned, that they could get weakened. Earlier, they could take, because they're all oppressive and increasingly authoritarian regimes in the global south. There's no question that there is a decline in democracy, but still opinion matters, because you can have different kinds of uprisings when people realize. So therefore, regimes are turning this anger against the West to divert from their own oppressions also. So that's how it is. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, we'll come to a question here about Russian security concerns, which I think everyone has mentioned so far. The question from an anonymous attendee is, do any of the BRICS countries refer to any international norms from the modern era that provide some kind of an objective basis for Russia's so-called security concerns? Who would like to kick off?
I could probably start.
Sure.
So obviously, a big references to the UN Charter, Article 51. It wasn't the case a year ago, but I think within a year, the foreign policy circles in Russia have sort of polished the references to the UN Charter. So now this is a part of the newly adopted foreign policy concept. It was adopted about a month ago, if I'm not mistaken. So that refers directly to the self-defense clause, basically. So that's a very clear reference to an international norm. In addition to that, early on at the start of the war, Putin was referring quite a lot to the right, or even the responsibility of Russia to protect the rights of Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine and people who identify themselves culturally Russian or Russian Orthodox in Ukraine. So that was a reference to the human rights. He did not cite specific clauses in the international human rights conventions, but he did refer to the need to protect from, in his eyes, Nazi Ukrainians. So that was the two most obvious references to the international norms that I have spotted so far, but there might be some more. So I would be happy if colleagues can step in and maybe quote some of those. I could only comment on Russian side. I obviously listen to a lot of Putin speeches at the moment.
We feel for you, don't worry. Dr. Wang.
Okay, I'm not sure it's global norms or not, but if you look at the Chinese media's, mainstream media's portrayal of the war, or why Russian started the war against Ukraine, basically the predominant narrative is that the Western countries, especially the United States, did not adhere to its promise at the end of the Cold War and expanded NATO to the Eastern Europe, and which provoked Russia to fight back for its own security reasons. So maybe it's not really about international norms, but it's certainly about something about balance of power or geopolitical strategies like that. So that was so in that way, in the Chinese media's narratives, so the West, not Russia, provoked the war, just like what John Mearsheimer said, lately.
Yeah. Okay, those are all the questions that have come in. So I'm going to ask a question as a politician. I wonder if the panel could talk, if I could come to each of you in turn. How do you assess Western engagement with the BRICS countries? Where do you think the opportunities are for better engagement? For example, in climate. I say this, of course, as the MP that hosted COP26 in my home city. Is it in technology and technological standards? Is it in global finance? Where are the areas for opportunity that were perhaps missing between the West and BRICS countries? And I'm happy to take whoever wants to come in first, and I'll do a full round the houses. We do have a bit of time, so if any of the attendees do have a further question or two, feel free to type it into the Q&A. And whoever wants to come in, Elizabeth, yeah, please, yes.
From the South. So I think before one looks at the missed opportunities, I think it is important also for the West to reflect on some of the narratives. So certainly, and you know, for example, in Europe and particularly the EU, there's a conversation about having an equal partnership, say, with, for example, with Africa. But you know, it's always off the mark. It is, firstly, the power is asymmetrical, and secondly, I think there is a great deal that is assumed and, you know, goes back to stereotypes, etc., which makes it very difficult. And I think what if I reflect a little bit on the South African situation, also bearing in mind that the chattering classes in South Africa have actually argued that, you know, South Africa should take a different position on Ukraine than the government has. But if we reflect a little bit on the issues that the South African government has really taken umbrage at. The first has been the way in which particularly Europeans, but also Americans, although apparently Americans eased off a little bit quite earlier on, was the way in which they didn't even listen. The way in which the foreign ministry tells the story, they didn't even listen to why South Africa wanted to take the position it was taking. And so there was a real lack of respect. Not just, you know, in South Africa, but that's a general observation that many countries make in the global South. And I think that's, you know, those issues are important because there is, I think, a great deal of opportunity for cooperation on climate, on technology. Well, and some of these have to also change the paradigms in which the West sees these rules sort of taking place. But I think one of the fundamental problems that African, and here I'm going to talk specifically about African countries, face is the issue that they're often bullied and they're not, as a result, respected. Their opinions are not respected. And so that has to change. And a lot of the reflection on double standards at the UN, where certain cases need to be condemned, but other invasions are not, even without a UN mandate. And here for Africa and for South Africa, it's not just Iraq, it's also what happened in Libya. All of those play into the way in which the BRICS and other global South countries look at the opportunities for African countries as a whole believe that, you know, we want to engage with both the West and the East and China and Russia. Climate is one area, but here I think if we're talking about climate, we also need to think about the way in which the European Union on meeting their net zero and the consequences that might have for developing economies. And here specifically on the EU, I'm talking about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, where a country like South Africa will be seriously disadvantaged in the next 2 to 3 years, because we're not going to be able to really come off our high carbon footprint. The European Union, US is saying to African countries, you can't exploit your gas or your oil, but we are during the war actually ramping up from other sources our use of fossil fuels. So these are parts of the issue. The other one on technology are really, it's not just about technology transfer, particularly not with the BRICS. It's about cooperation in scientific research development. But, you know, the way in which the geopolitics of technology are working out makes it, I think, difficult for some countries in that regard. And lastly, on the global financial system, I think there is a lot of room for reform there in a way that doesn't disadvantage, particularly African countries. If I just think of credit rating agencies and the perceived risk that is much bigger than for the rest of the world. If I think about the way one accesses climate finance and funds, which is extremely difficult for African developing economies. If I just think of the digital tax, which and the global minimum tax, which is really great for global North, but doesn't do as much as These are all things at the global governance level that that certainly European Union, UK, the US could work towards making it more appropriate, more helpful for developing economies.
Thank you for that, Elizabeth. Who wants to come in next?
Okay, I'll do it.
Dr. Chinoy, thank you.
Yes, I think Elizabeth's outlined it quite well, except to add one issue which she didn't, and that is on debt. When India says it's a voice of the global south, the first point they take up is really the issue of the need to restructure debt when countries like, I mean, even China and even India have written off the debt of the most highly indebted countries. They believe the West also should. Now, as far as India is concerned, they're very ready and they really love to engage with the Europe and with the US on all these issues. But at the same time, I think they want them to understand that given the fact that they still have to get millions out of poverty, they cannot agree to some of the climate net zero goals and completely fossil fuel, kind of rules like the West can. They're still dependent and they will continue to be dependent for some time. And therefore, the West needs to understand their position. Again, on technology transfer, of course, they would like a more technology transfer and joint production, which they have, for example, with Russia, and that is why they take in so many Russian arms. The level of joint production that's happening between Russia and India, in India, and export to third countries, is huge in terms of all kinds of weapons and missiles, which the West wants to just export it and India to be a net importer. So I think they feel that this kind of understanding would help. And lastly, again, on what we have been talking about, geopolitics, I think the West needs to understand why almost the entire global South, without any coordinated body, they don't have a single structure which brings them all together to formulate any opinion. But why are they all saying the same thing repeatedly? And why are they all saying that, allow us, we want this multipolarity, which is basically what? Anti-hegemony, all power being concentrated in one set of countries. Why does it help them? So that they can leverage between the two, that they can gain from both sides. And that was a model which India used in the 1960s, 70s, and that is why India has come up to where it is. Because this was a time when the West felt that they didn't want to support India's, especially the US, felt they did not want to support India's, public sector kind of development, but Russia stepped in. So they felt they gained from this, and they're not willing to go back from this historical, economic, and social experiment, even though the government currently is so opposed to the earlier government's paradigms and positions, and we're a properly neoliberal, wanting to be globalized economy. And now the West has suddenly said they're trying to deglobalize, whereas this benefited China and India. So, so now they're being forced to accept this new deglobalization and friendshoring and reshoring. So they have to keep conforming to these ideas, which means that they have to restructure their entire economy again. First, they integrated. Now there is this new nationalism. So, there needs to be this kind of understanding. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Chinoy. Dr. Wang or Dr. Shashanova, do you want to come in at all?
Yeah, it's okay for me to go first.
Please.
Yeah, I think I agree with Dr. Shenoy's views on the nationalism, the problem. Okay, so first let me talk about engagement policy. I think generally speaking, the Western world, especially in the United States, people believe that engagement policy toward China failed. So engagement perhaps become a more marginalized voice in at least in the United States. Nevertheless, I don't think that it's a completely failure if we don't if the Western world don't engage from beginning. Well, perhaps we will lose many things. I mean, economically and politically. For example, if China keep that kind of very enclosed and revolutionary, status for decades, what will happen? I think the current how say that? I understand that engagement policy now became a very marginalized voice in the United States or perhaps also in Europe, especially on a high politics level. But one thing I want to remind is that keeping communication is very important. For example, one scholar in the United States, he wrote that, well, before, years ago, before, there were about 100, more than 100 different programs for communication between US and China. But now it's become almost zero. I think that could be dangerous. And the other issues, non-political or low political issues, engagement policy is still very important. For example, like no matter it's about climate change or business, or technology, education, that all matters. And one thing I want to mention here is that a worrying trend in China now is the growing anti-American and anti-Western nationalism. I think one of the very important problems now is that there are many people in China, when they read the news or the media, it's a bit hard for them to understand the intention of the no matter it's American or European government's foreign policy toward China. So in that way, there's quite a lot of, I should say, disinformation or misinformation. It's very important for the Western countries to strengthen its communication with the society in China, or social groups or individuals, no matter through education or through other dialogues, through or through any other, say, conferences like that, to let the audience know that why, for example, like the Europe or United States behave in this way or adopt as a policy toward China, to eliminate or at least reduce this bias. That's quite important. I think one of the very important things the EU can tell China is about, for example, like how the European states evolved, right, from that kind of very warlike or aggressive past to today's very peaceful and developed security community. And what this kind of lessons China can learn, right, how to understand this mechanism of keeping peace. So, I mean, this kind of communication between societies are incredibly important for, keeping this kind of engagement policy on. Although I think the engagement policy will be very difficult in a high politics level, but in a low political or non-political level, there's still many things we can do for China and also the West.
Thank you. And Dr. Sharshinova.
Yes, thank you. So I think the situation in the Russian Federation is probably a bit similar to what Dr. Wang described in China. So there is a strong anti-Western sentiment, and climate change efforts, global climate change efforts, are generally considered to be not necessarily an invention of the West, but probably a Western dictated global agenda, which is also politicized. So this is general, I think, perception among general, like, Russian public, but also among Russian policymakers. So climate change is mentioned in Russian normative documents, but it is mentioned, the narrative is sort of mixed with the anti-Western sentiment again. So it's basically saying that We are interested in combating the effects of climate change. We are interested in protecting our environment, but at the same time, we would like to make sure that the climate change agenda is not politicized by the Western countries. So generally, that would be a narrative. And I think that can be quite counterproductive. I mean, I can see partially probably where Russia comes from, because quite a lot of the normative frameworks around the world have been adopted at the times when Russia was not in the best shape politically. So maybe Russian interests were not taken into consideration back then, but turning it into yet another area of global information warfare is very counterproductive, and first of all, for Russia itself.
Thanks for that. Okay, we've managed to inspire 3 questions from the panelists. These will be the final 3 to get us through the final 15 minutes or so. I'm going to come to the first one from Heinz Gartner. What can the BRICS states do to prevent the war in Ukraine turning nuclear? Who would like to come in? If we can try and keep the answers fairly short, we can hopefully get through all 3 of these.
I could probably go.
Yeah,
but
please.
I'm afraid Russia is in an interesting position as a BRICS state, because obviously when we talk about prevention of the war in Ukraine turning nuclear, I think we're mostly implying that how do we prevent Russia from using nuclear weapons in the war? Now, it's quite difficult to say exactly what the measures would be. In my personal opinion, I do not think that Russia would go that far, because obviously the use of nuclear warfare is very difficult to control. The implications will be harmful not just for Ukraine, but also for Russia, because Russia is so close geographically. It's quite unpredictable. So I don't think Russia is that irrational, to be fair, to engage in nuclear warfare. But then what do I know? Honestly, like a year ago, more than a year ago, people were questioning whether Russia would attack Ukraine generally. And I think quite a lot of us were not expecting that would actually happen. So I would take any predictions from the Russia experts with a pinch of salt, because we have not proven ourselves particularly useful a year ago. But I do believe that Russia is not that irrational, because it is suicidal, to be fair, to apply nuclear weapons so close to their borders.
And as an example of how unpredictable, we have just, of course, last month had the anniversary of the Chernobyl incident, albeit that wasn't nuclear war. Elizabeth, were you looking to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one point. I sort of agree with what Aycan has said. Well, I hope he's not that irrational. But I think it's also important that a country like China, which has actually, I think, made that point, continues to make the point about that, use of nuclear weapons should not be on the table. I think it is important the West has made that point, but I think it is important for a country like China, with the close relations that it has with Russia, the fact that Russia, I think, I think depends quite a bit on China at the moment, that message is constantly sent and clear.
Okay, I'm now going to come to a question from Susan Stewart, and I'm wondering if it's the Susan Stewart I know and who I think it might be, but I'm not certain. And this is a question that I know a lot of people would love to know the answer to, or to hear some views on. So going back to the NATO enlargement question, it is certainly true that Russia often voiced its opposition to this. However, there was a demand from numerous European countries to be allowed to join NATO, which in the end many were able to do. Why is there a belief in some BRICS countries that Russia's concerns should have taken precedence over the desire of the countries which joined NATO in recent decades in order to enhance their security? So again, if we can keep the answers fairly short, we can get to Ivan Campbell's question, which I think is a nice place to end. And with that, I'm going to come to Dr. Wang.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Well, I think that's depend on the interpretation. Again, the elites have a lot of power to interpret that in terms of the strategic interests. For example, if China has that kind of strategic alliance with Russia, of course, the elites will promote this kind of pro-Russia narratives, and that could have a really strong impact over society, even academia. So, I mean, again, interpretation matters.
Anyone else want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I can. Well, no, Dr. Shinoy, you go.
Yeah, I think how I would see it is that, of course, China and Russia and others should make sure that this never happens. But NATO also has a responsibility. They cannot keep saying that we reject every proposal. For example, China did present a peace proposal, and I remember on February, this came on February 23rd, and they announced that this was going to come. The US said we reject it. I mean, it was before. Ukraine didn't say we reject this peace proposal, but the US said. So that gives the impression that Ukraine is not in full command of, and there have been opportunities for peace earlier. April last year, the possible peace agreement, the fact of the, so there are many ways of ensuring security, not just through a military alliance. They could have, and I mean, it's no point going into all these ideas now, but I think Kissinger or Mearsheimer and many people spoke that a country like Ukraine can be a bridge between where both can be security guarantors. But the US was not willing to accept this. So really, I think there has to be some collective thinking on this, because if nobody can ensure that Russia will not use nuclear weapons, because if they see it as an existential threat, which they do, and if some nuclear missile or tactical missile, even by fault or without intention, unintentionally goes into, let's say, Russian territory or near Moscow, they'd hit back. So we need to put those safeguards. And it is sad that global disarmament has stopped and has been stopped for several years. And treaties like START 1 and 2, and ABM and nuclear non-proliferation, nobody is talking about it. And those of us who are opposed to this, all this, we want global disarmament, but I think NATO has a responsibility also, not only, but also along with these other great powers. Thank you.
Elizabeth. I think you're still on mute, Elizabeth.
I think the South African government and many others will argue that NATO should have disbanded at the same time as the Warsaw Pact. I think my particular, I think the interesting point to highlight was that before 2014, the majority of the Ukrainian population, as I understand, were actually not in favor of joining NATO. But I think with the annexation of Crimea, that changed, and then there was that march towards where we are today. I think, there is one can always argue that every country has the right to choose the alliances, the partnerships it forges, etc. But the reality is, and this is unfortunate, is that some countries have less choices, fewer choices than others. And I think the point was made earlier about, how the US respond. Well, we know how the US responded to Cuba. The US responded to sort of, weapons being placed in Mexico, or Mexico joining a foreign alliance. The point, of course, here is, and so Ukraine, I think, as a bridge, as a buffer state, I think from a geopolitical perspective, makes a lot of sense. Unfortunately, one has to always take into account the kinds of positions and security perspectives that great powers have. That's just a fact. We may not like it, being smaller powers, but that's just a fact of life. Having said that, of course, the argument about the invasion on the 24th of February was that, Ukraine wasn't imminently going to join NATO, nor were there NATO weapons stationed on the territory of Ukraine. But I think, the perspective of many in the global South notwithstanding the fact that many of the post-Soviet states saw greater security in joining NATO from what they saw as a colonial power, Russia as a colonial power. I think the geopolitical context is such that sometimes you have to listen to what great powers say, and maybe you want to push it up to a point. But I think Ukraine was the last straw, and that is not in any way to justify what happened last year, because I think that was an invasion. But I think geopolitical considerations have to be factored in when we make certain decisions, sadly.
Okay, thanks for that. This is going to be the final question, so I'll come to each of you for an answer to it. And this is a great question for us to end on. So thanks to Ivan Campbell, who's posted this one in, having joined us slightly late. Ivan, this question hasn't been asked, so don't worry. Ivan asks, bearing in mind the next BRICS summit is in August, what would the panelists see as a positive outcome in relation to the Ukraine war? So I'm going to come to each of you for a final answer. I need to have a hard stop at 30 minutes past the hour. So I'm just going to go from the top of my screen round, starting with Elizabeth.
So I think that is a difficult question. Certainly from the BRICS perspective, the proposal of the Chinese in terms of some principles around which to push for some sort of negotiated settlement certainly is potentially on the table, and I think there is a long while to go between now and August. I don't know. It all depends with war and the encounter. I'm not quite sure that that's going to be one of the key points, key outcomes of the summit. To be quite frank, I think one of the there is expansion, which is where we're going to be tabling a set of terms of reference for how BRICS will expand. But I don't know if there'll be much on then the in terms of peace. Right.
Thanks for that, Dr. Chinoy.
I think the argument in BRICS will be, as it has been in the past, that there needs to be a quick and negotiated settlement. There should be an armistice. There should be a ceasefire. But they will not give an exact roadmap. That would be for Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and Ukraine and whoever is behind Ukraine to sort out. It would be similar to the 12 points that the Chinese proposed on February 24 this year. But it won't go beyond that. It cannot go beyond that. And Russia will also agree, as they did. They will also agree, yes, we do want a negotiated settlement, but the terms of the settlement, which is the real nitty-gritty of, whether it's line of contact or about territory, etc., no other country can really come to this. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Dr. Chinoy. Dr. Shashanova.
Yes, thank you very much. I think the upcoming BRICS summit will be very important. I don't think that Russia would be willing to at least publicly listen to the Western states, the US, the European countries. So under these circumstances, BRICS is probably the last chance to negotiate something, or at least like to convince Russia to take a different turn in its politics. Moreover, Russian public considers China and India one of the most friendly countries in foreign politics. So I think I know it's not a democratic country, but still public polls usually do reflect something in the country. And the public polls in Russia showed that more than half of Russians believe that China is the friendliest country at the moment. So that's 55% think so. Second was Belarus, if I'm not mistaken, but third was India. So given this, I think it is quite important to countries like China and India to voice their concerns, to try to negotiate something out of it, to be facilitators, mediators, peacekeepers. And I think it is in their hands. I think it is possible, because Russia would probably maybe not listen realistically, but at least it would help them keep a good face in the negotiations for the rest of the world.
Thank you very much. And last but by no means least, Dr. Wang.
Okay, thank you for the question. Honestly, it's a bit hard to predict what they will do or what they will say in the summit. I believe that it depends on who can dominate the table or dominate the dialogue. They all have some different interests regarding the war. And I believe that the states, except Russia, will all be kind of cautious in making any statement. So I don't really think there could be positive summit outcome, but I would prefer to believe that they may have a more compromised, a kind of balanced statement or outcomes that can cover all of the interests from different states, and meanwhile do not offending anybody. Again, I don't think BRICS is a very coherent, like say strategically coherent a body or alliance like that. So I cannot really make any prediction, but I think that could have a very compromised outcome.
Okay, thank you very much. We've come in 3 minutes early, so that's definitely a success for all of our panelists. Thank you so much for joining us on this session. Thank you to Susan and the team at the Foreign Policy Centre for putting it together. I have got about 7 pages worth of notes, as well as having tried to chair this event to keep it going. I have found it enormously insightful, as I'm sure everybody who has joined us have found it as well. So thanks again for everybody for giving up their time. Thanks to everybody who's come and joined and submitted their questions. And I'm sure we will all look forward to the next Foreign Policy Centre event, which they will be putting probably on their social media and website and elsewhere. But thanks again, everybody, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.